Neighbor's Choice returns. I'm David Gronowski, your host. Happy to be with you. The headline says in CNBC that judge denies bail for Ghislaine Maxwell, the henchman for Jeffrey Epstein and his diabolical operations on behalf of powerful entities. So she'll have to await her trial in jail July 2021. Wow. Now that's a gauntlet right there. I'm not sure how long the turnaround is, but you don't think they could speed that thing up? Given the circumstances of her sidekick? What happened with him? That's government for you. Can't respond to market demands, can it? Another headline on CNS News, record federal spending deficit intensifies. Inflation spikes. Another headline, executives at bankrupt companies scored $131 million in bonuses. JP Morgan reports highest quarterly revenues ever. So it's the status quo, folks. Inflation saturates the poor and middle class because the newly created credit for these bailouts and the cash goes to the elites, the bureaucracies, cronies, Wall Street, people that hate free markets. And then what happens? We get blamed because we had too much economic liberty. We're told, hey, it's a late stage capitalism. It's not late stage capitalism. It's called late stage stupidity that would make you think that. That's the story we keep seeing over and over again. People using the power of the state to fleece the public and then tell the public through their nice little mouthpieces, their six-figure corporate communist professors, that no, ladies and gentlemen, the reason why it's so corrupt is something called a free market. Greed only exists if you have freedom. If we take your freedom away, the greed just goes away. And another argument they'll say is, well, yes, there is big government collusion with big corporations, but that's only late-stage capitalism. That's a Marxist idea, right? The idea that the final stage of capitalism, before it falls apart, is the collusion between the state and corporate interests. That's not true. That's the fever dream of a failed Messiah, Karl Marx, who thought he could think of a utopia better than the reality of the vision for history that Jesus had. Karl Marx was jealous of Jesus, and therefore he coveted Jesus' message of the kingdom of heaven. And he thought that he could reinsert the ancient way of sacrifice into Jesus' message of the kingdom of heaven and outflank Jesus, that he could provide a better solution for the people and their poverty than Jesus' project. Jesus used nonviolence. And Karl Marx thought he could speed up the process of helping the poor through violence. And he tried to dress it up into a scientific explanation of history, of class consciousness. But nevertheless, it was still a justification, a mythological justification for the use of violence to solve problems. And therefore, it was nothing new. It was the same old mythological justification for violence that ancient societies have had way before Karl Marx. It was just old-fashioned, stinky, warmed-over tyranny and might makes right, dressed up in the new garb of victim concern of the proletariat. Karl Marx was bitterly jealous and very envious of the power of Jesus' nonviolence and his message for the kingdom of heaven, that the first shall be last and many of the last shall be first. All of these different social justice theories always take parts of truth and then they distort it with the perversion of violence, the perversion of self-righteousness. All these different intersectionality ideas are all about trying to create a conspiracy theory in history of an oppressor class and an oppressed class. They want to make motherhood a conspiracy concocted by men trying to subjugate women. They've even written stories that say, that folks who, that buildings that are designed in a, tall skyscraper manner are an emblematic representation of the subjugation of women. What? As if women were just totally victims their entire existence on earth. Have women been victimized? Absolutely. Men have been victimized too, in different ways, in different fashions. You look at the death toll of murder, right? You look at the death toll of war. Mostly it's filled with men, young men's bones on the battlefields of war. That doesn't mean it's a competition. Every time you mention this, people's knee-jerk little dialectical binary way of thinking says, oh, well, but women are, no, men are. It's some stupid little victim Olympics always starts up every time you have a conversation about these things. But all of the different intersectional theories are conspiracy theories that try to selectively create a narrative in which one group is the oppressed the entire history, and the other is the oppressor. And as I've discussed in other programs, most of these things are rooted in, they think of basically history starts at the Enlightenment period. Everything was basically in a nebulous, perfect state of nature. And then the Enlightenment comes and Christianity comes or whatever. They have different narratives, but it's all basically the problems of the world are Christianity, patriarchy, whiteness. They want to demonize people's skin tone as a kind of vengeance fetish. This is what happens when rebellious minds encounter the story of Christ, but they don't want to repent. They'll come up with any kind of justification possible to maintain their self-righteous ego. It's patriarchy's fault. It's Christianity's fault. It's capitalism's fault. It's whiteness's fault. Anything but the human heart's fault. Right? Anything but the human heart, universally, that's on trial in terms of the record of history. So every time you see intersectionality, just remember these theories are nothing new. They are the perpetuation of old archaic myths of folks trying to justify their power through taking on the persona of a victim. Gods themselves in the ancient world were victims, and people would put on the masks of gods. I want to repeat this. Gods in history of the mythological world were themselves victims at one point. If you go to the top of the mountain where Zeus is alleged to have been born, and if you go to Greece and look at the mountain where the god Zeus was allegedly born, you will see the bones of a teenage boy sacrificed. Therein lies the glory of Zeus. A teenage child, alone, in a thunderstorm, on the top of a mountain, being sacrificed in the ignorance of his community, believing that this was just and right and good to do this. So people take on these masks of these gods throughout history, that these gods are themselves victims, so they put on these victim masks in order to justify their self-righteous need to sacrifice somebody else, to blame somebody else, to blame some other institution for the problems of the world. So this is nothing new when we look at the McWoke community as an ideology. The McWoke ideology. Most of the folks that are, repeating their slogans, they know not what they do. And hey, even the ones who create the ideas don't know much what they're doing either. But it's the intention of the crowd mind that is the woke, I call it McWoke, because that's what it is. It's McWoke ideas. It's their intention to justify themselves by donning the God mask of victims in order to sacrifice their neighbors rather than face the reality of history, which is that human beings universally have an appetite to sacrifice others and to hurt people and to dominate others and to oppress others. Any occasion will be the occasion. Any excuse will be the occasion for humans to turn to sacrificing violently other people. They'll use gender, they'll use race, they'll use ideology, they'll use nationalism, they'll use ethnic identity, they'll use any occasion as the excuse to dehumanize, to disparage, and to create a pecking order that is protected and enforced through violence against others. And Jesus provides a revolutionary counterforce that is destroying that power way in history through a nonviolent dismantling of this evil way of treating people. And he does it by protecting the human person. Because if you protect the human person, then it's very difficult to create the kind of hive mind necessary to dehumanize people because of their identity in a group. To dehumanize people, you have to use an arbitrary identity marker that you can say they belong to a group which can be hurt, right? This is the problem of history. It's not one race or one gender doing all this. It's all human beings, whenever they have the opportunity in history, falling into this trap. If you're disabled, that means you belong to a group that can be scapegoated in ancient times. If you're disfigured, that means you're cursed by the gods. That means we can hurt you, as the Greeks did in the Pharmakos ritual, where they would parade a hunchback or someone disfigured as a sacrifice to laugh at. And now we're doing it today. We still do it. It's weakening. It's losing its power. It doesn't unite us like it did in the ancient world, precisely because Jesus' counter story is defeating our old appetite and our old privileges of scapegoating people and sacrificing others while donning the masks of victims to justify us in our actions. We're in an epic fight here. And the news is so much more interesting than you could possibly imagine once you understand the anthropological context in which Jesus, as the hero of history, is battling and dismantling those old impulses of human nature to dominate and subjugate people with a self-righteous zeal justifying. He's destroying that myth. He's destroying our self-justifications, and he's getting us to confront ourselves in the mirror, and we don't like what we're seeing, and we're finding ever creative ways to deny what we see in the mirror. A Neighbor's Choice will continue to show that mirror. Stay tuned. More in just a moment.
Ronald Reagan would turn over in his grave if he saw what's going on today.
Crazy things are happening.
You cannot be afraid. You've got to stand up for what you believe is right.
But one thing is for sure.
You can't trust anybody.
For talk, news, and information, you can count on us.
Enough is enough. I mean, I almost blew a gasket.
Good for the country.
I know what I'm talking about. A lot of wackos out there.
Your connection to talk about it. The all-new News Talk 1040 WHP.
Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg is in the hospital. She's being treated for an infection in a stent that was put into place after she had gallbladder surgery a few months ago. The 87-year-old is expected to be released within a few days. The first COVID-19 vaccine tested in the U.S., developed by Moderna, boosted volunteers' immune systems. Researchers say all 45 people given the vaccine also developed COVID antibodies. Dr. Anthony Fauci expects COVID deaths to continue to rise, but not like in the spring, he says, because more of the cases this time are in younger people.
So even if young people, which some do, get sick enough to get hospitalized, it is highly unlikely that the death rate among them are going to be at the level of the death rate of what we saw.
That Fauci speaking to students at Georgetown University today. The White House rescinding a rule that would have required international students to transfer or to leave the U.S. if their schools only offered online classes because of the pandemic. Daria Albinger, ABC News.
Welcome back to A Neighbor's Choice. I'm David Gronowski, your host. 727-587-1040 is the number to call. That's 727-587-1040. 727-587-1040. Here's a story in ScienceDaily.com. Neanderthal interaction with Cro-Magnons. Here's the story. Neanderthals apparently coexisted with anatomically modern humans beginning some 100,000 years ago. However, about 45,000 years ago, at about the time that stoneworking techniques similar to those of Cro-Magnon people appeared in Europe, Neanderthals began to be displaced. So when we talk about creating stories to justify our violence, we have to remember the Neanderthal. The Neanderthal was our fellow. And anatomically modern humans displaced the Neanderthal. So much so that when you even mention the word Neanderthal, it has become synonymous with not smart, a failure. So you want to talk about hegemonic displacement and subjugation. Let's talk about the Neanderthal. Did Neanderthals have dreams? What were their dreams at night? Did they have hopes and goals? Did they wonder if their children would have a better future than themselves? We know they painted. We know they enjoyed a sense of the sacred, burial rituals. We know they had tools. We know they had passions and desires. So why is it that we accept the otherization of the Neanderthal, totally wiped out in history, but yet some folks, according to these DNA tests, still have Neanderthal blood in them? They still carry the memory of their Neanderthal ancestors in their blood. There's some evidence that ancient humans and Cro-Magnon ate Neanderthals, assaulted Neanderthals, outcompeted Neanderthals, exploited them, and erased them from history in terms of being a visible voice in our memory. To the point now, Geico and others have used Neanderthals as a systematic scapegoat for us to mock and laugh as not as smart as us. But did they have feelings? What were their dreams at night? Did they enjoy their families? You see, if we're going to play this game where we try to rewrite history, that history can be written over and over and over again in different ways, when it ultimately comes back to a universal indictment on the human itself. That the human being is the one who is indicted in the human heart. But that's something that the modern myth makers of fake news today cannot stand the thought of. They want to rewrite history and frame it in such a way that they can make one villain class and one victim class. So they want to remind you that, indigenous cultures were displaced and subjugated by frontier settlers. But they don't want to tell you about the cultures that some of those indigenous cultures wiped out before them. Outcompeted, hurt before them. And they don't want to tell you what happens after that, the Cro-Magnon, the Neanderthal, and so on and so forth in history. But the question is, how can you arbitrarily define who's been hurt and who hasn't? How can you create these stupid fantasy versions of history in which you blatantly lie about the record of human history in order to justify the otherization and demonization of whole groups of people? People will lie to you and tell you that motherhood and the celebration of motherhood in monogamous relationships is a conspiracy of the church. But as I can show you, you look up the statue of the Venus of Willendorf or whatever, 45, 50,000-year-old statue, and motherhood is, let me tell you, celebrated in that statue. So every time you hear the seductive pool of self-righteousness draw you in to say, oh, all I have to do in order to be considered better than my neighbor is to chant certain slogans and to get on the same groupthink wavelength. All I have to do is demonize certain identity markers in humans. Maleness, Christianity, American, any kind of thing that you can demonize. And it's not just, it's all identity markers can be used and have been used to hurt people. And they're being used all around the world. And ultimately, those arbitrary pointing of people's identity markers to make them less than are all just obfuscating the fact that we're a lot more similar to each other than we'd like to imagine. And so therefore we have to come up with arbitrary dividing lines in order to hurt people to gain favor and to gain delight over people that we're jealous of. We're a lot more similar than we want to believe. And so we cover that up with justifications of dehumanizing people based on identity markers like gender and race and nationality and religious affiliation and philosophy, to the point where creepy people in the New York Times were making an axe emoji against Bari Weiss because she's a liberal, but she wasn't radically corporate communist enough for her contemporaries. People feel the need to hurt and bully people. Why? Because what? I guess her ideology was not as dogmatically bigoted as theirs, and so they felt the need to hurt and shame and marginalize and pick on. That's what all human beings have been doing. We're all tempted by that, and we all need to stop it. And history has to be told correctly in order to stop it. That's the point. History is part of our ability to figure out the future. If we keep lying about our history and selectively, arbitrarily manipulating the record of it such that you can create these oppressed narratives to justify hurting people, then we're never going to get through this. It's always going to be a continual escalation of violence and the destruction of property and prosperity and abundance for everyone. So the human species needs to grow up. And the project that Jesus inaugurated into history, what I have dubbed the personhood revolution, does just that. It helps us grow up. It helps us get over the lie of politics and blame games and to think for ourselves so that we can discover amazing secrets of nature that can alleviate the effects of scarcity in our life. Scarcity are things that make it difficult for people sometimes to achieve material comfort. Scarcity is something that draws people into conflict because they feel as if there's a finite amount of resources and therefore they have a kind of death drive in their attempt to grab those resources. But if you can alleviate that scarcity through technology, solving things like cancer and diabetes with things that are not toxic, that are not obscenely expensive, then you have alleviated the scarcity of life that people feel in fear of those illnesses. If you can alleviate the scarcity of energy so that you don't have to get taxed by rent seekers at the gas pump through big oil cartels and taxed at the utility level with old forms of energy, if you could have market innovative energy, 24/7 solar panels, things that can keep you independent, then that opens up all kinds of avenues for you to develop yourself, develop your family, develop your talents, your music ability, your art ability, your crafts, and all kinds of other things. It opens up the opportunity for humanity to get going and maturing. So everything in the news that you're being inundated with tries to keep you stuck in that zero-sum, finite, scarcity-driven mindset. And they use the scare of scarcity to drive you into the hands of petty tyrants in government and their little buddies in government propped up corporations and universities. So why do we deny the dignity of the Neanderthals of our history? They were eaten, they were assaulted, and they were wiped out by modern humans. And yet their DNA carries on into a certain percentage of the population today. How can we otherize their memory to the point where we want to glamorize humans that destroyed and displaced them and ate them out of existence? Maybe we need to rethink the conspiracy theories that we take for granted as history. Conspiracy theories that cleverly justify our own bigotry, our own self-righteousness at the expense of others. maybe Neanderthals do dream. And we should remember those dreams. And stop lying. Stop trying to mythically cover up their voices. Perhaps their voices cry out from the earth, asking us to recall the truth about human nature and its universal fallenness and our need to repent. A Neighbor's Choice will be back in just a moment.
A lawsuit is not something that anyone looks forward to. It can be devastating. There is a law firm in Tampa Bay that will keep you informed throughout the entire process. That law firm is Catania & Catania. Personal injury law is defended with full disclosure. There is no guessing game. If it's an auto accident, medical malpractice, nursing home negligence, unsafe working conditions, or motorcycle accidents, the law firm of Catania & Catania will handle the process worry-free from start to finish. Many victims do not even realize that they can claim compensation for their loss until they talk to Catania & Catania. They only represent private individuals and treat every case as if it's going to trial. Putting families first is more than just a slogan. It's their way of practicing law. It's a commitment to you. Remember, they don't get paid if you don't get paid. So go to CataniaCatania.com, award-winning over 28 years and family first. Catania & Catania, personal injury, auto accident, and motorcycle accident attorneys.
Monitoring spokeswoman.
Coronavirus is threatening the entire world. Could you protect you and your family? Even getting tested can cost you up to $3,200 out of pocket. Would you be able to afford that for you and your family? Well, free Obamacare will cover and protect today. New insurance may cost you nothing. Zero premium plans are available. If you've lost your job, you must call 877-652-0244 or text VIRUS to 919191 or log on to freeobamacare.com. Call us today. We'll get you enrolled, get you qualified coverage to protect you from not only this outbreak, but day in and day out sickness and illness. Our plans cover visits, testing, emergency and urgently needed care, medications, and more. Now more than ever, you need to act now and call now. No long lines, and we can get you coverage today. That's 877-652-0244 or text VIRUS to 919191. That's 877-652-0244.
Conservative Amanda Mackey earned the American dream. Mackey escaped a brutal regime that persecuted Christians. She worked her way through college and served in the Pentagon after 9/11. In Congress, Amanda Mackey will stand with President Trump to support our brave police officers, secure the border, and enforce the rule of law. Mackey will protect Florida families from crushing tax increases and eliminate job-killing regulations to rebuild our economy and get Floridians back to work. With Charlie Crist and Nancy Pelosi exploiting the coronavirus to advance socialism, Florida needs to send a conservative fighter to Congress. Here's Amanda Mackey.
Charlie Crist and Nancy Pelosi want to turn America into a socialist country. Together, we can stop them.
Conservative Amanda Mackey has lived the American dream, and now she's ready to defend it as our voice in Congress.
I'm Amanda Mackey, and I approve this message.
Paid for by Amanda Mackey for Congress.
So here's a piece of myth making in action. It's everywhere. I'll just selectively find this. It's at the Sierra Club, a great arbiter of truth. SierraClub.org. Racism is killing the planet. That's the article by Hopkins. The ideology of white supremacy leads the way toward disposable people in a disposable natural world. The article says, we will never survive the climate crisis without ending white supremacy. Here's why. the article says. You can't have climate change without sacrifice zones. And you can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people. And you can't have disposable people without racism. The article goes on, in order to treat places and resources as disposable, the people who live there have to get treated like rubbish too. Sacrifice zones imply sacrificed people. Just think of Cancer Alley in Louisiana. Most of the towns there are majority black, and nowadays they call it Death Alley because so many black folks have died from the poison that drives our extractive economy. The article goes on, devaluing black and indigenous people's lives to build wealth for white communities isn't new. White settlers began that project in the 15th century when they arrived in North America. Most native peoples of North America lived in regenerative relationships with the land. They were careful to take no more than the land could sustain. The settlers had another ethic. They sought to dominate and control. Do you see how they're trying to create a myth in which there is a unique people group they're trying to quarantine as uniquely guilty and evil? This is old-fashioned myth-making, okay? This is not new. Every ancient society and all the way up to now does this. This is nothing new. This is not avant-garde. This is really dumb, old, microwaved myth-making where you put in truth, but then you twist it just subtly so that you can dehumanize an entire group of people in a self-righteous fervor. They make these black and white cartoonish lies about history. There are truths there, yes, right? But they try to make these pieces of truth and these little half-truths to try to make them the full truth so that they can dehumanize people and create political power, ultimately. The settlers cleared the old-growth forests and plowed the prairies to make room for their wheat and their beef. They nearly drove the bison to extinction in a calculated scorched earth tactic that was a part of a larger ethnic cleansing agenda. How could the white settlers bring themselves to do it? The article asks. They did it by telling a certain story about native peoples, a story that said native peoples were less civilized than white settlers and therefore deserved to be terrorized and pushed from their lands. This doctrine of discovery was a religious belief for many European settlers. The doctrine said that any land discovered by Christians was theirs because of the inherent inferiority of non-Christian peoples. Eventually, this pernicious idea made its way into U.S. law. In 1823, the U.S. Supreme Court, in the case of Johnson versus McIntosh, ruled that the principle of discovery gave European nations an absolute right to New World lands. It's no secret that our country was built on a foundation of enslavement of black people, the theft of native land, and near genocide of indigenous people. U.S. institutions from our government to Ivy League colleges were built on a foundation of stolen labor and stolen bodies. The compound interest on the profits from that enslavement became the basis of intergenerational wealth for white communities. The intergenerational wealth that perpetuates race-based economic inequality to this day. And it just goes on and on and on, trying to create a reverse scapegoat narrative, which is there have been bad things, but we're going to quarantine guilt into one people group, and it's the usual suspects. I just got done telling you. They scapegoat you because you're Christian, if you're European, if you're, anything, that they're trying to create a reverse scapegoat narrative to dehumanize and to create a revenge hierarchy. That's not going to work. That's what all human history has been doing. In the old days, they didn't have to bring up victims in an obvious way. They would just say, no, we've got the power, therefore we get to subjugate. Therefore we get to monsterize. But now, because we're so infected with Christian morality and Christian story sense-making, folks who want to perpetuate the cycle of scapegoat violence and sacrificial oppression, they have to do so in a way that takes on the garb of being the defender of victims. Remember, the word paraclete, which is the word for Holy Spirit in the New Testament, means the defense attorney for victims. So would-be myth makers today, like the Sierra Club, Hop Hopkin, they take kernels of truth, but then they create a selective reading of history. They don't talk about the Neanderthals being eaten alive by modern humans and Cro-Magnons. They don't talk about that. Wiped out of human history. They selectively, they focus in on certain things. They try to create a narrative in which there's one villain group and then the rest, everybody else are victim groups. And that's the way they try to cartoonize history so that they can quarantine guilt into one direction so that they can justify the perpetuation of the sacrificial violence that they're condemning. Do you see it? It's a sleight of hand trick that humans do when they're resisting and rebellious to the personhood revolution of Jesus. They tell partial truths, but then they obfuscate the reality such that they can perpetuate the same violence and dehumanization that they're condemning in history. They're trying to prey on people's ignorance and their government education that they've received from garbage universities and garbage public schools so that people they're so low information and they don't have critical thinking skills oftentimes that they're not able to question and challenge these cartoonized, bigoted views of history that want to quarantine all evil actions into a certain direction. So males have been in conspiracy to hurt women the whole time, and that's the whole history for feminism. And, white settlers are the worst people. Nobody else ever, they really want you to believe that this is a unique phenomenon of one particular group. In fact, the record is clear. Modern humans ate Neanderthals out of history. And Sierra Club doesn't know what to do about it. Because if that's true, they're lies that the state will solve our problems for us if they sacrifice someone's money and sacrifice people's lives and sacrifice speech and sacrifice property and sacrifice freedom. They're afraid that if that truth comes out, that their false god of using the state to suppress people will crumble under the weight of its own lies. And so these sad little myth makers, they don't know what they're doing. They know not what they're doing. And so we have to forgive them as they try to reinsert bigotry and violence to get revenge and to have self-righteousness reign supreme. It will fail, as all the other attempts of self-righteousness and bigotry have, because the master of history, Jesus, is in the driver's seat of history, and whatever the ignorant bigots want to do, they can't stop it. I'm David Gronowski. Godspeed.